Hello, this video from Chapter 5 will talk a little bit more about loops, specifically the syntax for loops, using nesting and some additional tips for loops. The for loop is an alternative type of loop, an alternative to the while loop. In the for loop, you indicate the starting value for the control variable, you test the condition that controls loop entry, and you allow the expression to alter the loop control variable. And you do all of this right within the parentheses following the for loop. So the for loop incorporates the control variable and the incrementing right inside the control statement. It's all built in. A for loop has, as I mentioned, a control statement that includes the variable initialization, testing, and updating. And then those variables that you create for your for loop cease to exist when the loop ends. So those variables are out of scope for any other statement outside of the for loop. So to give more specifically the syntax, put that into context, you can see here very simple example from the textbook of doing the same thing in a while loop as in a for loop. And you can see that the for loop is much more efficient. So in the while loop, you remember we had to declare a loop control variable. And then after assigning that loop control variable a value, the programmer wrote a while loop, and at the end of the while loop, they incremented the control variable. In a for loop, that is all done inside of the parentheses. So the variable is initialized. It takes part in a Boolean expression, which is in the middle, and then it's incremented at the end. So the syntax for a for loop, inside the parentheses, you always have three different elements, and they are separated by semicolons. So you have the control variable initialization, you have the Boolean expression is always the second thing, and the count variable, the change that you make to the count variable happens at the end. So that can either be like incrementing it by 1 or incrementing it by whatever number, by 10, by 2, subtracting 1. But at any rate, it replaces the line of code that you have to have at the end of a while loop. So the advantage is that you don't have to have a separate loop control variable declaration, initialization, and you don't have to remember to put an incrementer at the end of your while statement, which I almost always forget to do when I use whiles. My preference is to use a for statement. You can use a for statement to replace a while statement 99% of the time. The only time that you cannot use a for statement in place of a while statement is if the loop control variable is something that you need to use outside of the loop. Because in a for statement, as I mentioned, the loop control variable is just built into the loop, and outside of the loop, it has no meaning and you can't use it at all. So let me jump to some code. I'm actually going to open up the code that I had on my previous video with the bank interest, and I'm actually going to recreate this loop except with a for statement. So here I created a loop control variable and initialized it to 0. And then my Boolean expression was if the count variable is less than the number of periods. And then at the end, I had my incrementer incrementing statement. So all of that can be done in one line with a for loop. So with for, the first of the three elements that you include in the parentheses is your loop control variable initialization. So I could say int count equals 0. Then the second of the three elements is your Boolean statement. So this is going to be the same as the Boolean expression above. And then the third element is the incrementer. So I've taken care of this, this, and this all at once. So now inside the for loop, I just include the rest of my calculations. So I'm just going to copy and paste that. Now this is giving me an error because I'm duplicating my code from up here. I had already declared an account variable, so I can't do it down here. That's because I shouldn't have both of these in my code. It's duplication, it's redundant. So for your own copy of the code, I'm just going to put the for loop inside of a comment. But then if you download my code, you can have the copy and you can see a comparison of how the while loop and the for loop can do the exact same thing. Now I'm going to jump back to the slides. I'm just going to mention nested loops. Just like if statements can be nested, loops can be nested as well. You can have an inner loop and an outer loop. The inner loop, in this case, would run all the way through until the Boolean statement is no longer true for every single iteration of the outer loop. And this can get complicated. So hopefully you don't run into too many examples that need a loop within a loop. I don't think in this class we're going to do any loops inside of loops. But you can you can mix and match nesting loops and if statements. So you could have a loop inside of an if statement, and if statement inside of a loop. Mix and match, pick your poison. Any of those things would work. So I'm going to do another example that will show you a loop that has an if statement embedded within it. And this example, I'm going to create an application where the user can input a word and the application will count the number of vowels that are in that word. Before I jump over to Visual Studio to do that, I will note that there are a few more slides about improving loop performance. These slides are not necessary for the class. They won't be on any of my quizzes, exams, or projects, but it's very good information, particularly if you're planning on programming after this course is over. I would save those slides and take a look at them, learn from them, bookmark them for later. The slides are attached on the course website on the same page where I'm posting this video. That being said, I'm going to jump over to Visual Studio and create a new project. I'm going to call this Count Vowels. Okay, I'm going to put a text box where the user can input a word. So I'll just call it input text box. I'll put a label instructing the user please enter any word or phrase. Then I'll add a button. I'll call it my count button, because what it's going to do when the user pushes it is count the vowels. And then I'll have a label at the bottom. I will just call it output label. And by default, I'll just have it be blank. Okay, so hopefully you're starting to see a pattern here in the examples that I do. The first thing I'm going to do in my code is save the text that the user input as a string. So I'm just going to call it string input, and that will be the, what did I call this text box? Input text box. Whatever word the user put into this input text box. Okay. Then I'm going to count the vowels, and I'll come back to that. I'm just leaving some pseudocode. And then at the end, I will display the answer to the user. So my result, no, I think I called it output label text, will be there are, and then we'll have some number. And append vowels in that word or phrase. Okay. And there's an error here because I need to replace this comma with some actual code. Otherwise, the C# is trying to read a string plus, and then another plus, and then a string. So this is going to be represented by an integer variable that represents the number of vowels. So I'm just going to initialize actually that variable up here at the top. So I'm going to have an integer called number of vowels, and I'll initialize it to 0. Okay, and then we'll run some code to count the vowels. And then at the end, I'm going to put that number of vowels into this string, into this output label. Okay, so how do we actually count the number of vowels in the string? Well, one way we could approach this is to use a loop, because we could think for every letter in a string, we're going to test whether that letter is a vowel. So if we're doing something, if conceptually you're talking about a problem and you say something like, for each X in Y, we will do something, then you can guess that you're going to use a loop, because you're going to do something over and over again for each whatever. So in this case, for each letter in the string, we're going to test if it is a vowel. So in this case, I will use a for loop. In a for loop, control statement, there are three elements. The first is to initialize a count variable. I'll just call it x. For int x starting at 0, while x is less than the number of characters in a string. So the input string, so this is a string variable representing the word that the user input, dot length. Okay. So this is saying that we're going to, however many letters are in that string, that's how many times we're going to go through this loop, because we're going to start at 0 and then we're going to go up to the length of that string. So if the user input the word dog, then this would be equivalent to we're starting from 0, and while x is less than 3, we're going to execute this loop. So this loop is going to run 3 times if the word we input was dog. Okay, and the third of the 3 elements inside the parentheses for a for control statement is your incrementer. So we'll say plus plus. So what that means is the first time we run through this loop, x is 0, and it will execute whatever code is here. Because 0 is less than, say, 3. Let's say the user input the word dog. Okay, so then when it reaches the end of the for statement, it will increment x. So now x is 1, and then it goes back and it checks. Okay, is 1 less than 3? Yes. So we're going to execute the code in the loop body again. Okay, at the end, x is incremented to 2. So we check again. Is 2 less than 3? Yes, it is. So we will run the code in the loop body again, so on and so forth, until x is no longer less than the length of the word. So basically what this loop is allowing us to do is look at each letter of the word or phrase. Well, string is the better term. Okay, so how can we look at an individual letter in a string? Well, we can use the substring method that we learned in chapter 2. So if you recall, the substring method you use by typing the name of the string variable and then dot substring, and then the 2 parameters inside of the parentheses. The first parameter is the starting position and the second parameter is the length. So the starting position, instead of putting a literal number, I'm going to use the loop control variable. And then for the second parameter, I'm going to put the number 1. Okay, so what does that mean? That means that each time we go through the loop, we're going to find the character that is in that position, and that is just 1 character long. So the substring, what it does is it takes a subset of the characters from a string, and that subset is defined as starting in this position. So if I had put the number 0, that would mean the substring of characters that starts at position 0. But in this case, instead of putting a hard-coded number, I put the variable. So the first time we go through this loop, it will look at the substring starting at position 0. The second time we go through this loop, it will look at the substring starting at position 1. The third time we go through the loop, it will look at the substring that starts at position 2, and so on and so forth. And we're always only looking at 1 character at a time. Okay. So what we want to actually do with this substring is see if it is a vowel or not. So first, let's save this substring to a new string variable. I'll call it letter. Okay. So every time we circle through this loop, we're going to create a variable called letter, and it's going to be the single letter at whatever position we're at for whatever iteration we're going through. So the first time we go through the loop, the string letter will be the first letter of the word. The second time we go through the loop, the string letter will be the second letter of the word. So if the user had input the word dog, then the first time we go through this loop, string letter will be assigned the value of D. The second time we go through the loop, string letter will be assigned the value of O. The third time we go through the loop, string letter will be assigned the value G. And then at that point, X will no longer be less than the length of the word, and so we'll exit the loop. Okay, so we are saving a single letter from a string into this variable called letter. And what do we want to do with that? Well, we want to check if that letter is a vowel. So we're going to use an if statement here nested inside of our for statement. So if the letter is A, or if that letter is E, or if the letter is I, or if the letter is O, or if the letter is U. Then we're going to count it as a vowel. So we're going to take our number of vowels variable and increment it by 1. Okay, so one more time, let's conceptually go through this example. Say the user inputs the word dog. What happens? First thing is the word dog is saved to the string variable called input. The integer number of vowels starts at 0. Then we start a for loop. We say we're going to start at 0, and we're going to go until, and each time we loop through, that x loop control variable is going to increase by 1. So the first time through, x will be 0. The second time through, x will be 1. The third time through, x will be 2, and so on. And we're going to keep executing until x is no longer less than the length of the word dog, which is 3. So this loop is going to execute 3 times, once when x equals 0, once when x equals 1, and once when x equals 2. And then when x becomes 3, this Boolean expression is no longer true, and we exit the loop. Okay, so the first time through the loop, x is 0. Our input word is dog. So we take the first letter of the word dog, because we're taking the substring starting at position 0, which means the first letter, and taking just one letter out of the word dog and saving it as the string variable called letter. So at this point in time, our first time through the loop, the string variable called letter is holding the value D. Now we check, is this true or not? Is the letter D equal to A, or is the letter D equal to E, or is the letter D equal to I? So the letter D is not equal to any of these, so this gets evaluated as false, and so the if statement body, the body of this if structure does not get executed. So the number of vowels stays at 0. Okay, now we've reached the end of the for loop, and now x is 1. X being 1 is still less than 3, so we're going through our for loop again. So at this point in time, x is 1. So the substring of dog, starting at position 1, which means the second letter of the word, 1 character long, is saved to the variable called letter. So at this point in time, our second time through the loop, the string variable letter has the value of O. So now we evaluate this expression in the if statement. The letter is equal to O. So now this statement is true, and the number of vowels increases from 0 to 1, which is what we want to happen because this is the first time that we've encountered a vowel in this word. Okay, third time through, x equals 2. X being 2 is still less than 3, so we go through the loop one more time. This time, the string variable called letter is assigned a value of g. We check if this statement is true. It's not, because g is not any of these vowels, so the number of vowels remains the same at 1. So then x becomes 3, which is no longer less than the input.length, so our Boolean expression is false, and we exit the loop. So after exiting the loop, our number of vowels variable is now equal to 1, which is correct because dog has 1 vowel in it. So now we display to the user there are one vowels in that word or phrase. Simple example, I won't complicate it by making the English match by saying 1 vowel instead of 1 vowels. All right, so I'm going to test that out. And I will note that I put all capital letters, and those have to match exactly to case. So actually the user has to put their word in all caps for this application as it currently is programmed to work correctly. So if I type dog in all caps, it should say there are 1 vowels in that word or phrase. My spacing is kind of weird. I could fix that. And you'll see if I type it in lowercase, it will probably tell me there's 0. Yep, there's 0 vowels because it's only looking for those capital vowel letters. I'd have to go back to my code and change that. I won't take the time to do that in this video. Let me test another one. Door in all caps. There are 2 vowels. Great. Looks like this application is working correctly.